So that would be starting on A with my ideas and also coming back to A. What happens if I start on the next note, which would be the ninth of our A minor chord? Are you comfortable phrasing ideas? That's the really important thing there. Can you phrase ideas that land here and sound good in the same way they sound good when you land on the root of that chord on the 1? What happens if we take the third? If I do the same thing, just put the backing track on quickly, starting on the third. Being really comfortable phrasing on that note. What about the fourth? What about the next note in that scale? So we might go through like this. And starting on that note and really holding that and making that sound really good. And you know, I'm not going to demonstrate all 7 notes here, but just to give you an idea of a framework that you can use in your practice. If you are someone who's not very familiar with all of those notes and how all of that works, it's going to be very difficult to use chromaticisms, because a lot of chromaticisms resolve into all the other notes in the scale. So if you're not familiar with that, then you're going to have a hard time. So again, if you have something that you want to practice before you even get into chromaticism, make sure that you are able to start all of your licks in different places in the scale, end them all in different places on the scale, end on all of these different ideas, and make sure that those all sound good, and you've got 100 different ideas off of every note in a Dorian. That's a really good place to start with this before you even think about chromaticism. So shall I continue on that, or is there any questions so far?
Is that backing track in the book?
Yes, so the backing tracks that I'm using here, that A Dorian backing track, and there are 4 other ones that are contained in Stepping Outside book. So if you wanted to just go away and immediately practice them over a backing track that's done, it's all live instruments as well. These backing tracks are really well done because they're not just someone's programmed drums or something. They're all played in with really good players. So that's something that makes them sound a little bit more natural, a little bit more live. So yes, if you buy the book, they're all contained in that. Are there any questions on anything I've just said so far?
Not on what you've... Oh, well, kind of. So Vince here has asked, I'm wondering if a good approach would be maybe start with a major scale and add chromatic notes according to one's taste. Is that where we're going?
So that's more or less what we're going to do. But again, it's really important that if you start adding the chromatics too early, what often happens is you sort of monkey see something, monkey do something without really hearing it in your head as to where that's going to resolve. And chromatic use is all about resolution. It's all about trying to resolve phrases in a way that makes sense. And so hearing where they could resolve to is the real game here, and that's the thing you really want to work on. So make sure you can hear all the notes in the scale before you start putting in the ones that aren't in the scale, if that makes any sense. So the thing I want to move on to next is then looking at all of the notes that create tension and all the notes that we don't have in A Dorian. So in the A Dorian scale, the upper extensions of the chord, being the notes that aren't in an A minor 7, so the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th of that chord, are going to be the available tensions. Now, it's not the same in every single mode, it's not the same in every single chord, but in A Dorian, we get all 3 of those. So when I play those notes, they create tension that then can be resolved in a different way, but they're diatonic still. So they're not wrong notes, they're not chromatic notes yet, but they still give us some tension. So just to give you an idea of what those sound like, if I play the 9th, that creates tension over the chord. You want to hear something else after that, it doesn't sound resolved. The 4th does the same thing. You really want to hear this resolve back to there or something like that. And the 13th is exactly the same. That also creates tension. So these upper extensions of the chord are notes that create tension. But the interesting thing about a lot of improvisers is they'll learn to sort of use those things naturally without thinking too hard about the theory, because they're still in the scale, so they sort of experiment with them without really digging into what they sound like. But again, slow things down, really make sure you're happy with how those notes sound. And from there, we can then start adding some of the chromatic ideas. But the really important thing is, know when things start to sound really bad and how not to use them first. So a really good example of this is if I pick a note that's not in a Dorian, let's say I pick the flat 9, which is going to be B flat, and I just play this over the backing track, nothing I do with that is going to sound good. If I just keep holding on to this note that's always going to clash horribly against the chord. So because of that, a lot of people immediately jump off that note. They're immediately like, well, I don't know how to deal with it. I don't like the sound of it. It doesn't sound good, and therefore I'm going to avoid it, which is the first mistake that happens with all of these things. What you need to do instead is sit there and think, well, how does that note resolve? Where does it want to go into something that actually sounds good? Does it want to resolve downwards when I play it first? Does it want to resolve upwards? So that's a really interesting question to start with, and there's a lot of context to that. And the other thing here, which is the other foundational principle of all outside playing, is when I put this on a weak beat or a strong beat, and by that I mean if we're thinking in a 16th note grid, then we're thinking of the 1 and the and as the strong beats and the E and the as the weak beats there. If I put it on a weak beat, does it have a different rule set to how it behaves on a strong beat? So if I put on a strong beat, I have to do something differently when I try and resolve this note. And often with these notes that aren't in the scale at all, and these really dissonant sounds, the answer to that is yes, you have to think of them very differently. So the classic way of resolving this, the classic way of dealing with this problem would just be to resolve that note up. And more generally, that can apply to any of the notes in that aren't in this A Dorian scale. So there's a lot of them. There's your flat 9, which could resolve up a semitone like that to the 9th of the chord. There's the major 7th, which would be resolving up to the 1. There's the flat 6, which resolves up to the 6. And then there's the sharp 5, sorry, flat 5, which would resolve up to the 5. And then you'd also have the major 3rd, which can go up to the 4th. And all of those rules apply when that's on the offbeat with your phrasing. So when you start with that on the offbeat, it's very easy to use those notes. And I'll just demonstrate that now. So all I'm going to do is start my phrases on the offbeat or the weak beat, so E and and I'm going to immediately resolve every single one of those notes up a semitone. And you'll hear that in those phrases, it makes sense. You don't hear it as a weird note. So just to give you an idea what that sounds like, that was a flat 9, major 7. What about the flat 6? What about the flat 5? What about the major 3rd? So immediately, just by putting those on the offbeat, and that's the real kicker here, is that it's not about the phrase I'm playing after, it's the fact that I'm starting all of those phrases on either E or on the weak beats, on those notes, and then making sure I'm resolving them upwards. So this is a really good way of starting to think about those problems, is, okay, I'm trying to put these on the offbeats, I'm trying to resolve them somewhere that they all have the same rules for, so you don't have to think too hard about it. And that's the main thing here as well, is that if you have different rules for each one of these notes all the time, you end up thinking too hard and your improvisation doesn't really sound that good. So because of that, it's much better if you try and just apply the same rule to each one, try and phrase your way out of each note in that way, and just adding one chromatic note like that, start of a phrase on a weak beat, is going to really help you get an idea of what you can do with this. Moving on though, what happens if we do put it on a strong beat? What happens if I put that note, the flat 9, on a strong beat of the bar? How do I make that work? How do I work that out? And again, this is where sometimes transcription is a really good idea. This is sometimes where, and in the book, I've transcribed a load of the things I'm about to talk about here, but we start talking about chromatic cells. So things that allow you to resolve a certain note, so you don't have to think about it because it's a cell that you've learned beforehand. It's like 3 or 4 notes long, and it solves a problem for you. And that problem is I'm trying to resolve the flat 9 when I play the flat 9 on a strong beat. So a good example of this would be a chromatic enclosure. If I do something like this, all I'm doing there is I'm playing the flat 9 then basically going either side of the root here, and then resolving it here to the root after I've done that. So that phrase is really common. It's one of these things that happens all the time in a lot of chromatic phrasing. But what happens with it, really importantly, is the start note is on the beat. So I am now going flat 9 on the beat. And that allows me to use that note in a way that I couldn't before when I was limited to the offbeat, doing things like that where I'm sliding into a note. So some of these cells allow you to use these notes in different rhythmic connotations, which is really, really fun in that way, because what we're doing now is adding a lot of freedom to our playing. So if I can use a phrase that starts on the offbeat, like that, where I'm sliding up into the note immediately from a weak beat, and if I can also start these on a strong beat and go like that, then no matter when I put the flat 9 in my phrase, as long as I know what it sounds like, I know how to do that, I can resolve it and it makes sense. So just to give you an idea of what that might sound like, I play the backing track again. This is what it will be like on the weak beat. I'm just going to play the flat 9. If I put that note on the offbeat, sorry, on the strong beat now. So there, you heard that as that sounded a bit weird, but it doesn't sound wrong when I go. Because what's happening there with that phrase is we are getting the resolution of the flat 9 via that chromatic enclosure that I've learned. And then afterwards, I play the chromatic descending idea. So to do that, so putting two things together, which we'll talk about a bit later in this masterclass. But the idea being that if I've got that sort of framework, that little chromatic enclosure idea, I'm no longer scared about using the flat 9 over an A minor chord. I can use it whenever I want, and it's still going to work really well. Any questions on that so far?
So we have a question on when would be a good way of practicing coming in on the offbeat or on the strong beat.
That's a good question. Yeah. So one of the things that a lot of people don't do enough of, I'm just going to quickly jump out of the backing tracks here and just get a metronome up just so people can hear this, is the internal logic of your phrasing when it comes to chromaticisms often is really, really obvious when you slow things right down. So if I play chromatic phrases or all these ideas, and I play them at like blazing fast speeds, you sort of get away with murder in a lot of cases, and like your lines won't sound great, but they're not going to sound terrible. But the problem with that is that you're not really honing into, okay, well, why don't they sound amazing? Why do they just sound okay? Like I don't really know what I'm doing. If you then slow those things down to 60 BPM, what you end up with is immediate sort of response to, I played that wrong, and I really know when I played it wrong. So just to give you an idea, and Luke, you can just tell me if this this metronome is at a good volume. So I'm just going to play this for a minute. So this is sort of at 60 BPM. So again, if you're using this this kind of system, what you can do is try and play endless ideas. So I'm improvising 16th notes like this. Eighth note, sorry, you can pick to do it even slower if you want to. So just like having an eighth note pulse, and what we're going to do is literally just endlessly improvise like this. So that's all diatonic. And you can just do that over and over and over again and just get your phrasing sounding really good and get familiar with that. And then start adding these notes in. So let's say I start adding the flat 9 to that. So I get... So in that case, what I'm trying to do there is when I play this phrase, that little chromatic enclosure, I'm trying to put that on the beat, and then when I put the flat 9 on the offbeat, I'm trying to just resolve it immediately, either up or down, depending on which direction I'm going. So I could go, or I could go something like that phrase doing this. resolving downwards like that, all I'm doing there is putting that flat 9 in between the ninth and the root, and you can really hear the resolution on the offbeat there. So it makes it really obvious when you make a mistake. If I just try and deliberately sort of mess this up, it's really obvious at this tempo when you do it wrong. If I do something like this and go like it's like you can really hear the grating nature of like what's going on there when you don't resolve things properly, and you put things on the offbeat that shouldn't be on the offbeat, or you don't resolve your phrases internally very well. So that's a fantastic exercise to practice that, if that makes any sense.
Fantastic, yeah, that does. And if that doesn't make sense, let us know in the chat if you want to.
Yes, yeah, please do.
That's why we're here. Cool. So one thing I want to just mention to everyone is you all got the email to join this call. In that email, there was the link to a page, that middle page on the site, either took you to Zoom or whatever. The replay of this will be there. So if you want to go back and watch this stuff again, you just go to that same email, you click through, and if you click the YouTube link, you can then watch a lot of this stuff again. I think I started it maybe 10 minutes late, but yeah, so don't panic too much if you miss something now. You've got that link to watch it, and that'll be there for 7 days. And then after that, this goes in the book. But yeah, cool. We got more questions. If you're happy for me to interrupt.
Yeah, happy for more questions to jump in. Yeah.
So we're still on the subject of enclosures now. I'll give you both these at the same time because you might want to connect them. So Richard's asked, do the enclosures only work for the root, or can they work for any diatonic note? And then we've also got, with enclosures, when do you use diatonic versus chromatic?
Okay, so yeah, both great questions. So enclosures as a general concept is probably something I could do an entire another book about. So like, it's one of these things where I'll try and keep this very succinct in this masterclass because it's a really interesting concept and it really sort of breaks people out of sort of playing scales and all those kind of things. But when it comes to the first question with, okay, can it just be done around the root? With that particular enclosure, absolutely not. You can do that all the way, you know, if I was to do something like, for example, around the fifth, so starting on the flat sixth, same enclosure, same thing, going chromatically either side of the fifth, that still resolves to the fifth really well. If I go like, sorry, mess it up, try that again. Something like that, for example, would be an example of using that flat six as a really dissonant note on the beat, but then using the enclosure to resolve it to the fifth. And that works really well there. You could also do this, you know, around the seventh. So I could do, if I'm here doing, this would be like my flat seven of the chord. So we could go and do the same thing. So a phrase like that, for example, I'm just trying to spitball some of these things. I don't necessarily use some of them. So, but like, again, it's something you could do if you wanted to. And then, you know, we could do that as well around the fourth. So that would be around the fourth, the same enclosure, either side chromatically. Now, the diatonic option of those things, that's a really interesting, again, this is not really related to chromaticisms, but it's an interesting little sort of experiment, is you can change those chromatic notes either side with diatonic notes either side. So instead of thinking the two chromatic notes either side, what are the two notes in the scale? It'd be this. So that still works really well. And again, on every note, let's say around the root, I could do that instead of, that would be the chromatic option, but the diatonic option would be something like that. Or, you know, if I did that, let's say around the third, this is a bit more interesting. We have the fourth and the second, so it's not symmetrical in this case. That would be around, like putting those notes around the flat third. And again, those are diatonic enclosures as opposed to chromatic ones. You can use whichever ones appeal to you. Again, the really important thing here is follow your ear. It's very easy and can in some cases be a problem with some players to be too chromatic and not use it tastefully in improvisation. And so it's good to familiarize yourself with the diatonic equivalent of those different ideas, because it gives you the same sort of principle, but a completely different sound and a bunch more licks that you can then work on. So being able to put these things together and use chromatic stuff when you want to use the chromatic stuff, but then also use the diatonic stuff to sort of space out those chromatic ideas and it means that you don't sound too harsh against whatever you're playing, is a really good idea.
Fantastic. Got a message from Callum. Would starting on the strong beat with a strong note or chord tone work too, and doing the chromatic note second?
Yeah, so in that case, you're sort of looking at, well, if I'm starting on a strong beat, how do I, that actually, I'll tell you what, that actually segues onto the next thing I wanted to talk about really well, so I'll probably go there instead. And this is the second way of thinking about chromaticisms. So one of the ways of thinking about chromaticisms is thinking like that, where you have a note that shouldn't be there, like the flat 9 against A, and you're trying to resolve it in a way that works. And the second way of thinking about chromaticisms is thinking about the gap between the notes. So instead of thinking, oh, okay, I've got, for example, this is the 9th, this is the 1, and this is the flat 9, I can think about these two notes in the scale, which would be the 9th and the flat 7, and I'm instead thinking, well, hang on a minute, there's a major third in between these notes. I'm thinking about this gap here. If I learn a chromaticism for the gap of a major third, what ends up happening is I can then reuse that every time a major third comes up in a scale or in this particular example. So for example, a very simple one would be that just going chromatically down to the flat 7 from there. And I could do it the other way around as well. I could go up like that. But every single time there's a major third in this scale between two notes, I can do that. So I could do from here, like this, or doing it like that. And that allows me to, look for all these major thirds. There's another one here. And I can start making ideas and licks off of those major thirds. Or somewhere like here, or somewhere like here. So I'm looking for the gap there of a major third just to do some chromatic idea around that particular interval. A shorter one, for example, would be a major second. There's lots of major seconds. There's tons of major seconds in this scale. I'm looking for the gap between these two notes. Again, the common chromaticisms here, Stevie Ray Vaughan would do something like that, for example, just going up and down between those two notes. And again, you can apply that not just between the root and the 9th, but I could do that there. I could do it. That's the same thing, sorry. We could do something like that, for example. It's the same chromatic idea. Going like this, or going like this, or... But I'm thinking about the gaps here. I'm trying to see in the scale where those major seconds are, and I've learned this particular piece of chromatic vocabulary that works thinking about the gaps here. And that's a completely sort of different way of approaching it, but you can combine these two methodologies, one of like trying to resolve each one of the harsh notes against the chord properly, and the second being looking at the gaps in between each note and thinking, how do I chromatically play a phrase that's appropriate between these things? Is that making sense?
Yep, I think so. I see a lot of nods, so I'm assuming everyone's cool. Do you want another question? If
there's another question that someone's asked, I'm happy to answer.
We've got a couple that I might save because they're going to open some cool explorations later. I'll go for this one first, but I've not missed the others. Don't worry, I'll get to those. So Richard's asked, in 4/4, just to recap, are the strong beats 1 and 3, and the weak ones 2 and 4?
So generally speaking, when you're talking about weak and strong beats, and particularly with this kind of chromatic vocabulary, it would be unusual to play a lot of chromaticisms as 8th notes unless the 8th notes were very, very fast if you're playing at a very high tempo. So often we're thinking about a 16th note grid, which you normally would have 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. So each beat is broken up into 4. And the weak beats being E and so the ones just after and just before each beat, and the strong beats being 1 and. You can look at it as 8th notes and think of it, again, if it's very fast 8th notes, you think of the 1, 2, 3, and 4 being the strong beats, and then the and in the middle of each one of those being the weak beat. But that would be more of like the sort of jazz, traditional jazz way of looking at it, because in a lot of traditional jazz contexts, they do play things up in like the 200, 300 BPM tempos. And so you don't think of it as 16th notes at all. You think of it as an eighth note grid very, very quickly. So it really depends on like the genre as how you approach that, the answer to that question. But generally speaking, with funk stuff and this kind of like, fusion-y background, it's more of a 16th note grid.
And how does that relate to a triplet feel? Someone's asked.
So that's an interesting question, because the triplet ideas often, triplets often, at least in my experience or my impression of triplets, is that those things often sit over the top of what you're doing, and they don't necessarily fit with the groove and the context of what you're playing. So anytime anyone plays a triplet idea, they're playing something which doesn't have weak or strong beats in it in the same way. It's just sort of a phrase that hopefully comes in and stops within the boundaries of what you're doing. And there's got to be regular triplets. So because of that, you get away with more with triplet ideas in terms of being able to go almost more chromatic and weirder with some of your triplet grid than you can with a 16th note grid where you have these weak and strong beats. But also it does mean that if you overuse triplet phrasing, you really lose the feel of what you're doing. So triplets are a massive double-edged sword whenever you use them. You've got to be very careful about using them sparingly as an effect as opposed to something. So if I just demonstrate what I mean there, let's say we take this, again, this backing track here, my sort of triplet idea, that will be my triplet pulse. You kind of see I can get away with murder with that. Like I can start going outside, do some sidestepping, which we'll talk about in a minute later. But I can really sort of mess around with the harmony, and it still works as long as I come back in on something strong that works at the end of the phrase. But the problem there is that, as you can probably hear there, with a really long triplet phrase, you don't really get the feel of the groove. You don't really get the feel of like that backing track, that hard rock sort of drive there. So it's a double-edged sword. It gives you a more freedom, but it also allows you to sort of disassociate from what you're actually playing over in sometimes not a very good way. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was very helpful that you demonstrated it. I think that tied it all in. We'll just take a little break there because we do have to plug the book. So we have this new book out, which I'll post the link to in the chat, called Stepping Outside, which is kind of what we're talking about in this and then some. So we've got a question in the chat about using this in melodic minor. Can you tell us a little bit about the scope of the book and how far you take things and what it does?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is probably the most extensive thing I've ever attempted on the educational side of my business and what I try and do. It's trying to take people from not being able to play any outside stuff, really simplistic sidestepping ideas, really simplistic chromaticisms, into really, really advanced melodic minor use, half whole tone scale, chromaticisms within those concepts, which, again, if someone's asked about that, I'll talk about that as well, and all those kind of things, and superimposing scales over top of each other, so superimposing chord changes where chord changes don't exist, and making all of those things fit into each other and work and flow in a way that actually sounds really good. It goes from, like I say, 0 to as pretty much as advanced as you can get with this stuff. So because of that, it's a really good book for anyone to pick up, because I think people who are just getting into it are going to get a ton out of the first chapters, and people who have a really good grasp of this stuff already will still get to the last chapter and hopefully feel like they're learning a ton of material from that last chapter, last couple of chapters there, because they get far more into the advanced things. So it's a real sort of, here's outside playing for a really wide range of people, and it's a ton of exercises and examples as well. I think there's 150 examples on just like as lines and ideas that you can learn, and then there's also, I actually can't remember, is it 80 exercises or is it not?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's about 80 exercises, of which you can then learn the fretboard and learn how these things work over the fretboard with. So it is it's quite a tome in terms of the amount of material in it. There's loads of videography. I've filmed myself playing all the ideas in there, and all the exercises in there, and they're all recorded. So if you're someone who learns visually, you can use it like that as well, and everything's explained in meticulous detail as to what I'm doing and how I'm approaching it. So very much something I think a lot of the people on this call will be interested in.
Yeah, I can just say it's one of our thickest books. It's like 160 pages. I wasn't expecting you to turn in.
Yep.
It's just for the next few days. It's $20. It'll go up to $25 at the end of the week because it is so thick. But there's some cool questions here. There's some backing tracks in it, really great backing tracks made by Simon Peter King, who's phenomenal. There's someone's asked, does the book cover different genres or is it mainly fusion? You could probably answer that best. Talk about
yeah. So I was really conscious about again the fact that outside playing is something that you hear people do in the blues context. Like you hear Stevie Ray Vaughan use a bunch of chromatisms. You hear guys like Arthur Govan use a load of chromatisms in a bit more of a like fusion way. But then even his stuff is looking more towards the sort of hard rock fusion as it is, so like actual sort of jazz fusion. And then you've got the sort of Michael Breckerism way of thinking about these things, which would be more into the sort of actual fusion jazz, and these very different ways that things can be used. And it's so I've tried to make it so that the first backing track is sort of a hard rock thing. I think the second chapter goes more into the blues side of things. It goes more into using that stuff over like a blues context. The third chapter looks at a bit more of like chord changes and goes into like a 6/8 more fusion backing track. And we really sort of vary a lot of the material in there. So it's not a genre specific book. I'm not looking at like this is fusion and this is the only way to use it. It's more of a general, here's how to use outside playing, and all of these rules will apply to whatever genre you want to put it in.
Yeah, I think we titled it Rock, like Guitar Masterclass, because it's kind of like the second chapter is on the blues and the first chapter is that rock thing, and then it kind of goes to fusion towards the end because as it gets more and more advanced, it's you need that kind of testing ground for it. But if you're a rock player or a blues player, you'll find everything you'd ever need in the first 2 chapters and be super happy. Sweet. We got questions. Should we hit these questions again?
Let's hit the questions. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So one last question about the book is, will it include the theory behind the chromaticism other than just a bunch of exercises?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's a ton of theory in there. If that's something that you really want to dive into, and you really want to really understand the fretboard as well, there's a lot of fretboard knowledge things in there. So things like, okay, here are all the concepts, but how do I actually apply that to the fretboard and superimpose some of these ideas on the fretboard, and how should I think about that so it's the minimum amount of brain power for me to use and move around? There's a lot of things like that as well. So it's very guitar specific in that way, which will probably help with that as well.
So on that note, just a quick shout out to Jeff, our employee that makes the fretboard diagrams and had to make all the diagrams. I asked him, like, how's it going? He said, I'm seeing dots. And then he cried for an hour straight. It was the most awkward call I've ever had. Right. We've got to go back and clear something up. So you were doing that thing where you're adding in chromaticism between, you're going, oh, there's a major third, so I know this pattern for a major third. Can you just clear that up? Because we've got a question here, which is, when you're thinking of doing those things, did you mean you were thinking of the major third of the scale of the key? Well, what was that? Can you just explain that again?
Right, sure, yeah. So in the A Dorian scale, let's say we're playing this scale up and down. Within that scale, you can also look at how far individual notes are from each other within the same scale. So I wasn't talking about, okay, the major third isn't in A Dorian. That's not a note that you have in the A Dorian scale. What I'm looking at there is, let's say we take the ninth of the scale and then the flat 7 of the scale, and if just these 2 notes in isolation are a major third apart. But again, that's not the only 2 notes that are a major third apart. There are the 6th and the 4th are also a major third apart, and you could also look at these two being a major third apart. So it's finding where two notes in the scale that you've picked are a certain interval apart, and learning a piece of chromatic vocabulary that fits in that gap that works every time is a really good way of learning that stuff.
Gotcha. Callum, who asked that question, if you could. Okay, cool. That makes sense. Perfect. That mission accomplished. Right. I've not forgotten these questions. We're going to keep going up. But you just mentioned, when talking about the book, you mentioned it goes into superimposing chord changes even when they don't exist. Victor's asked if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things you see a lot in, again, this goes slightly more into the fusion background than it does into sort of like the blues and the rock way of doing these things, is you see people imagining that there are very common progressions within a progression in order to trick your ear into thinking, I feel like I'm hearing motion between chords, even if those chords aren't played. So a good example of this would be something like, let's say you're playing over an A minor backing track in this case, but a really common chord to resolve to A minor would be something like E7 or E7 sharp 9. And what you can do is you can say, when I'm playing over A minor, if I imagine for a minute there's an E7 sharp 9 chord in the backing track, even though it's not there, if I really commit to that as a sound, you can hear it in my playing, and it resolves back to A minor in a way that actually sounds good and doesn't sound like I'm playing over the wrong chord. So it's about superimposing something that pulls really strongly towards the A minor sound. A bit more of a Robin Ford way with this kind of progression, using the altered scale over the E7 in this case, doing something like that. Sounds like it resolves back to A minor, but that would also work if I do that, let's say over this backing track that I've just got. If I play an A minor, this is just like my A Dorian stuff. Now if I try and go into the E7, there, what I'm doing there is that brief phrase, that was not A Dorian. Those are the notes of your E altered scale, which is one of the modes of the melodic minor. But that pulls really strongly into A minor. So you can use that over the A minor backing track, even though it's not actually there, provided you do it tastefully, and provided, again, as I talked about at the start of this masterclass, you resolve things really strongly. And that's where you've got to really hear how the notes resolve into each other, how the scales resolve into each other in ways that work very, very confidently. Because as soon as that's not there, that falls apart immediately.
So we have a book all on arpeggio superimposition. It's called Arpeggio Alchemy. And I really believe in this book. I think it's incredible. And it was a legacy project for one of our authors who actually passed away. And I want to spread word of mouth on it. So if anyone, I'll have to crop this out of the call when this replay happens. If anyone gets Ben's book or pre-orders it, buys it on Amazon, email me and I will throw in a copy of Arpeggio Alchemy as well, which is a book all on triadic superimposition, and you can have the bundle for the same price. I will have to edit this out of this call after this goes live. But yes, I would like to do that. If anyone wants to buy, if anyone is on the fence of buying Ben's book and is also interested in that, I'll do a little bundle for you. Just email me, luke@guitarvivo.com, and I'll send you for the other one.
That was Don Mock's book, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
We managed to get it out about a month before he passed, and it's actually we were in such a rush. It's the book that gave me RSI. I was typing so much to get it out for him, and it really is like his magnus opus. And I want to.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Raise awareness on it, so I'll give it to you guys, and you can tell other people about it if you like it. Right. And also, I think it's a great companion for yours as well. I think they'd work really nice.
Yeah, I do. I think he had quite a similar way of looking at the fretboard that I did. So like, there's definitely things I think that people will realize that are similar between the two. Definitely.
Yeah. Perfect. Oh my God, you guys are awesome. So many great questions. I'm going to go back up because we had one about melodic minor scale. It was quite a simple question. It was just about how would you start to apply this to melodic minor scale.
Sure.
And a lot of these questions are also coming out from the standpoint of how do I get this in my ear as well? So hearing the melodic minor scale. Any tips on that? And I will just throw this in the mix. If you want to do some demonstrations over one of the other backing tracks so people can hear some of the cool stuff, you can even break out that secret backing track I told you.
Yeah, no, I might break out one of the other ones in a minute, sure.
Yeah,
but so melodic minor stuff, I think, you know, the main thing to think about with that is that quite often the same chromatic cells, the same things that you might use when it comes to, for example, I'll give you a good one. The what we just did. That idea of chromatically descending between notes a major third apart, those same things will apply in your melodic minor. So if you, for example, are playing instead of a Dorian, you have this out, which is your A melodic minor scale. What you can do is you can think, hang on a minute, well, the major 7 of that scale and the 5th are a major third apart. So I can do that as a melodic minor line, and what I'm doing there is applying the same piece of vocabulary but doing it within the melodic minor scale. So that allows you to, instead of reinventing the wheel for the melodic minor and thinking, I've got to learn a whole new piece of vocabulary or a whole new set of enclosures and all these kind of things, is just to apply that to exactly what you were doing before, and you know, just apply it to a different scale instead. And that gives you a little bit of vocabulary in those scales. So just to give you an idea what that sounds like over this backing track, I'm also going to try and answer the other question there, which was how do you get these things in your ear? Again, the thing to do with that is to really slow down your improvisations and to really try and hear all the notes as I talked about before. So let's say you're using the melodic minor over this backing track instead, which is going to sound a little bit weird because it's a hard rock backing track, but I'm sort of playing, you know, melodic minor, A melodic minor over it. So it's going to clash a little in a kind of interesting way, but the phrasing can still make it work. Now, in this case, what I want to be able to do is exactly what I did in A Dorian, which is, can I start ideas in A melodic minor on every single note of this scale and make sure they all sound good? So, for example, let's say we take the 9th, but this time we're using A melodic minor. That's the 9th of A melodic of the 9th of the scale there. I can do the same thing with the 3rd. Starting on the 3rd, starting on the 4th. That's the 4th, starting on the 5th. Starting on the 5th there, starting on the major 6. Sorry, that was Dorian. That would be melodic minor. Starting on the major 7. Something like that. So again, you get the idea here of what's happening is every single time I play a melodic minor phrase, no matter where I start in that scale, I know what those notes sound like when I start on them and when I end on them. And that's the best way to get any scale, any mode into your head, is just experiment with 100 ways out of each one of these notes until you get something you like. Now, obviously, the start of that, most people are going to start doing that, and they're not going to sound good. They're going to play those notes and think, that really doesn't work in my head, and you know, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes because I can't quite hear my way around. But don't try and over-theorize these things. That's the really important thing here. Is it's very easy to try and think too hard about what you're doing here. Fundamentally, what you're trying to learn is how those notes sound and how they clash against the chord and how they don't clash against the chord and how all this stuff works. So again, just explore it with some of the enclosures. Again, you can do diatonic enclosures in the melodic minor, for example. So instead of going, for example, we had diatonic enclosures like this in the Dorian scale. In melodic minor, it would be that kind of thing, because I'm going to the major 7 now. Would be an enclosure that's diatonic, no chromaticisms there. I'm using the notes of the scale, but it sounds very different because I'm using a different scale there. So again, that kind of exploration is super simple. Not enough people do it, and it's incredibly effective in order for you to learn the sound of a new mode or a new scale. Is that hopefully answering those two questions?
Yeah, so Victor said, so you're filling the gaps, but in melodic minor, right?
Yes, exactly. So again, let's say I do that now. If I just play over this backing track, all I'm going to do is use the same classicisms we just learned. So this, which was between a major second, and this, which is between a major third. If I just try and mess around with those ideas, those same chromatic ideas, filling in the gaps, but this time I'm using the melodic minor scale, it sounds something like this. So. Kind of get the idea there. It immediately gives you the same sort of flavors, and the same fretboard fingerings as well. So the nice thing about playing like that is that if you learn a chromatic cell, and that cell sounds really good, you're not really changing what your fingers are doing. You're changing the scale and you're changing your fretboard visualization. If you've learned how to do that and you've learned how the fingerings work, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're not learning some new crazy phrase. It's just applying it to a different scalic format, which allows you to use these things really quickly in a new framework, which is a cool thing to do. So, yeah, so hopefully a bit more clear.
Oh, perfect. Sweet. So, sorry, just was chatting to the guys in the YouTube chat. Guys on YouTube, if you have questions, put them in there as well. So, we're going back to this the superimposition thing. Vincent's asked, it makes me curious to ask for accompanying chords. I'm guessing also like this superimposition thing. What kind of chords would you say are most acceptable? Altered chords, major, minor, jazzy chords? Do you recommend a way to start out with this?
Sure. So the thing that a lot of people will do without sort of knowing it is playing phrases that sidestep. And sidestepping effectively is doing this, for example. And if you don't know what sidestepping is, this is a brief explanation of that. Often we look at this as in a pentatonic way to start with. So you might think A minor pentatonic, and then the sidestep from that would be to go up one fret and play B flat minor pentatonic, and being able to play those two scales next to each other. So you might end up with something like this. And then resolving that phrase. And I've gone into B flat minor pentatonic there when I've played that phrase, but it still sounds good, even though I'm superimposing effectively a B flat minor chord over an A minor chord, which to all intents and purposes shouldn't sound good. So the important part of that question is it's slightly not looking at it in the right way, in that you can almost make anything work, like pretty much any scalic change, provided you have really good contour to your lines. I'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute, and also that you're rhythmically doing things that work really well, and that you're, again, going back to the start of this, resolving things in a way that is really, really confident. So talking about resolution first, if I do something like this, and then I repeat that upper semitone, when I play this note, I've got to think, in A minor pentatonic, where I just came from, where does that resolve to? When I want to go, do I want to resolve it down a semitone? Something like that, or do I want to resolve it up a semitone to there? So again, with all of these phrases and all of these different things, it's more about finding the notes closest to where you are when you're playing outside, and making sure that when you transition back into the scale that you're using, those resolutions are super strong. If I do something like this, and then go, that doesn't really sound right, because what I'm doing there is jumping down a tritone after I've played in B flat minor, and that jump between, there's no resolution there that really works. Again, if I play that phrase again, if I do that, it just sounds a little bit weird. Whereas if I resolve that to the closest note in A minor pentatonic, there, that sounds much stronger as an idea because the resolution points are good. So again, when you listen to some players, they'll do crazy, outrageous things that don't even make any sense. I mean, there's a classic video of Michael Brecker playing rhythm changes on the internet. Rhythm changes being in B flat major, in the key of B flat, and he starts off playing in B major, so like a semitone out, and he commits to it for like 4 or 5 bars. And for most people, they would think that is categorically something you're not allowed to do. But because he resolves it in such a strong way, and because it's Michael Brecker doing Michael Brecker things, it sounds fantastic. And you don't really think about it as like, that's a wrong note, that's a wrong thing that you're doing. So that, again, just sort of proves a point in this, is that like there's a lot of different places you can go with how those things work. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to start with something like sidestepping, where you're just going up a semitone in your pentatonics, because that really teaches you these concepts, these foundations very strongly, because again, as soon as you do it wrong, it doesn't sound good at all. And so that's something else that's really important. The other thing I mentioned here was contour, which is a slightly different thing, but this is another way of justifying your phrases. And what I mean by contour is if you have an idea that has a certain intervallic formula or a certain sound to it, and you almost repeat that idea, but in the other scale, that's also going to give you a sound of which is going to sound really strong. So a good example of this would be, let's say I play something like that, and then repeat the exact idea up a semitone. So if I go, something like that, that works, that makes sense. And even though I didn't resolve it in the same, I didn't resolve to the closest note there when I played in B flat, what ends up happening is you hear that as 3 ascending phrases where I went, your brain picks that up as like I'm ascending with each idea, each phrase there. So I can justify, I could even go further than that, I could keep going and go, if I wanted to be, a little bit more ridiculous about it, I could just keep on going with that same idea, because the contour of it and the way it melodically works is the thing that your brain is latching onto each time. The repetition of it is the thing that you're able to use to justify that idea. And that's very different to resolving these ideas internally, but it's another way of justifying what you're doing, even if you're in different scales. So something sometimes you hear people do over chord changes, for example, let's say, going back to the idea of superimposing chord changes, I could play an idea in the pentatonic, and then play that same idea, but with the altered scale, and I'm just changing that one note there that needs to be changed in that same idea. And when you hear that over the chord changes, it sounds really good when people do that, when people sort of use the same idea but change only the notes that need to be changed to fit into that superimposed scale. That can be a really interesting way of justifying your outside playing. So that's another thing to really pay attention to here. Don't necessarily think too hard about, I have to go to the 5 chord, I have to go 5-1, or I have to go flat 7-1 or something like this, these like common ways of resolving into A minor. It's better to think, I need to really pick one and understand how that resolves and how I justify that one chord that I'm superimposing before you move on to the next chord. Hopefully that answers that question.
That was great. We've got a question. Oh, now my thing doesn't want to scroll up. It was just a question, actually, just on the language of chromatics. Do you consider chromatics to be when you're moving by half steps, or is chromatics anytime you leave the key and you play an outside note?
It's a good question. I think in my head you've got chromaticism as, and I'll demonstrate this actually because it's a good thing to sort of differentiate. You have chromatics as notes in between the notes that you're playing in the scale. So that's normally how I think about it. So when I'm playing chromatic ideas, I don't really see them as changing scale, if that makes any sense, or superimposing scale. Or when I'm superimposing a scale, I'm not thinking of that as a chromaticism. They're two separate things. Now you can do both at the same time. You can play, you can, like, let's say, for example, go up a semitone and play B flat Dorian, and then play chromatics within B flat Dorian to then give yourself an even more outside sound. That's something that you can do, and that's actually something that we cover in the book as one of these sort of underrated ways of really making your outside playing sound interesting. So if I just sort of go about demonstrating that, chromaticism in A Dorian would be something like, we're not really changing the tonality there. That's all, that's all sits within the A. You don't really hear it as chord changes when you listen to that. You just hear it as me putting notes in between the notes of A Dorian. Whereas if I now take that and I think I'm going to move up to B flat Dorian, you hear that as a harmonic change, or you should hear it as a different thing. So just to demonstrate that. That's more what that sounds like when I play a B flat Dorian. I'm superimposing that sound of B flat there. But again, it's really all about confidence and resolution when I'm doing that. You've got to really commit to that and play good phrases in B flat, otherwise the whole thing falls apart. Now you can do both at the same time. So for example, I can move up to B flat and then play chromatic ideas in B flat, which sounds something like this. So again, there you're really getting into a lot of very outside sounding vocabulary. And that's something that some people might actually think that's too much. They might not like that sound and they might not want to do that. Now I cover that in the book, but this is where, a lot of the stuff in the book is interesting, is that if you find something like that where it's too far outside, or it's something that you wouldn't use and you don't want to sound like, you can just move, play those ideas, look at the videos of me playing those ideas and think, I don't actually want to, spend my time learning that bit, and move on in the book to something else that maybe has a sound that you are a bit more interested in learning.
Fantastic. I always love when you give examples. That was pretty killer. So, we've got a question here from Pablo, which is kind of something we haven't touched on, which is actually using chromaticism when playing through chord changes, because I think this is chapter 3 of the book. Pablo's asked, any way to work in chromaticism when working on arpeggio connections, maybe over a 2-5-1?
Sure. So let me just grab that track. I've just got to remember which one it is. Unfortunately, I didn't. Here we go. So in this chapter, basically what we look at is going between D minor and F minor as like a static chord change. So you start off in the sort of in the scale of like D Dorian, and then we change sort of key and we go up to an F minor, and we go up to like an F Dorian sound. This sort of going up a minor third in between two chords is a very common fusiony thing to do. And again, there's a couple of ways you can look at this. One is to just think, well, I'm going to approach these as two separate things, and I'm going to think in the D minor, over the D minor chord, I will play D Dorian ideas with a bunch of chromaticisms in them, and over the F minor chord, I'll play F Dorian ideas with a bunch of chromaticisms in there. And I'm not trying to necessarily bridge the gap too much. That's often quite a strong way of playing over these things. Reason being is if you use too much chromaticism when you're bridging the gap between chord changes, sometimes you lose the sound of the chord change. It can be very easy, if you're not careful with that, to lose where you're going and lose the sound of like a strong 2-5-1 resolution. So in the case of the 2-5-1 that he's just said, you'd be almost better off playing chromatic ideas in between the notes of the 2 chord and then changing to the 5 chord, playing chromatic ideas between there, and then going on to the 1 chord. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do that, but it requires a very advanced ear and a very good knowledge of this stuff to be able to deal with chord changes and play chromatic ideas through those chord changes at the same time. So to start with, it's almost like you treat them as separate islands of which you are using chromaticisms in, as opposed to trying to deal with that over the chord change. So hopefully that sort of answers that question. Just to give you an idea of what that might sound like, this is the backing track that Simon did on that chapter. So this is in D minor. So in that, what I'm doing there is I'm not really using the chromatics in between those notes of D and F. I'm playing over the D minor chord, using chromatic ideas over the D minor chord, and then changing to F minor, F Dorian, and playing chromatic ideas over the F chord. Only when you're really, really confident with that do you then try and sort of deal with the change of D to F. Now, I do cover it in the book, a lot of ways of dealing with how to get from D minor to F in this chapter. So there is a lot of information on that. But again, it's one of these things where I would highly recommend not tackling that if you are not very confident with that as a sort of concept.
Nice. But I think it's important to say that they're both, just because one's more difficult and we've kind of, maybe put it a bit out of reach, that doesn't mean it's better. What you played is still almost more musical or more accessible, should we say, or more what the...
Exactly, yeah.
Don't want people to think it's like that they're doing a cop-out if they pick one way or over the other. You're allowed to stylistically pick these things, right?
Yeah, and like I say, I think the point I make on that is that some stylistic ideas take a lot longer than others to learn. So learning the foundations of playing over a 2-5-1 is a very different thing to learning a bunch of Alan Holdsworth vocabulary and having that as like your stylistic thing that you want to reference. If that's something that you're very into, or you're into players like Michael Brecker or some of these very incredible virtuosos historically, it's just gonna take you a lot longer to deal with that material.
Right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. What I want to do now is just continue with questions, but let you guys know that obviously this is a nice chance to put any kind of question to Ben if you want to talk about anything kind of that you might have seen that he's doing that isn't necessarily chromatic, or if you want to dive deeper down this ear training rabbit hole or rhythms, things like that, we can kind of open the floor and branch out a bit. While I let people think of some stuff, I've already got a question on YouTube. Could you give us could you pick another track and just give us 30 seconds of a go
Sure.
on another track?
Yeah, so
these are great tracks.
Yeah, they are fantastic tracks. Let me see if I can find the blues-based one. That's this one, I believe. Sorry, that's the wrong one. This one. Yeah. So this is sort of looking at things in a more blues context, and it's a more major blues context. So we're thinking. So it's a bit more of a sort of like, funk blues idea, a bit slower on that one. And in that chapter, we go into a lot of looking at it as like a major blues thing. So taking a lot of your minor blues pentatonic ideas, and then also taking that, in this case, it's we describe it as a dominant 9 arpeggio in that book, where we're taking this kind of sound. That kind of sound, and we look at sidestepping and chromaticisms within that, as opposed to chromaticisms within the sort of Dorian scale. So they sound different, and there's different sort of ideas and different concepts you can pick out of that. And again, something to experiment with and something to explore on that backing track as well. So we sort of go through from chapter 1 into chapter 2, taking all these sort of like pentatonic ideas and then starting to apply them to that almost like dominant pentatonic and dominant 9 arpeggio idea, and really trying to work through that in a blues context, which again is a very common thing to come up. So, you know, a lot of these backing tracks, the other thing I try to do with them is kind of tackle common chord changes and common problems that people have. So, you know, things that will come up when you're jamming with other people, things that might come up when you're playing in other people's bands and all those kind of things, these kind of chord progressions that are really common in that kind of stuff.
Cool. Okay. Right. Thank you for doing that. I always know it's a bit daunting when I just go play, but thank you for reminding me there. So we've got a couple of questions. One more on chromaticism from YouTube. When you're thinking of chromatic ideas, do chord scales always fall on the downbeat, or it doesn't matter? I think we kind of talked about that at the beginning. Can you just reiterate that quickly?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about the chromaticisms there, generally speaking, yes, the notes of the chord scale are the ones on the downbeat. That is a slightly dangerous way of thinking about things, because it doesn't always apply. So one of the things to really remember is over something like Dorian, for example, and in the Dorian mode, you can do that because all the notes are like available tensions. They all sound good. All the 7 notes of the Dorian scale sound good over that chord. Whereas if you're in Phrygian, for example, you've got the flat 6 and the flat 2 in the Phrygian mode, which are going to clash against the chord. Even though they're in the scale, they still clash kind of interestingly against the chord. So depending on what you're doing, you have to be careful about your use of those notes as well as all the chromatic notes, because if you just hang on, for example, the flat 2 in a Phrygian jam, you're going to have a hard time making that sound good if you're not careful with some of these things. So it depends on the scale you're using, it depends on the mode you're using, and in some cases those things are easier than others. Notoriously difficult things to improvise in, which a lot of people find difficult, are the Phrygian mode, Locrian, and actually the thing I've just demonstrated there with the Mixolydian, a lot of people hang on the notes of the chord scale that don't necessarily work as well as the notes of the dominant arpeggio. So in this context, the notes I'm trying to put on the strong beats are the notes of, as much as possible, trying to stick with that. And then you can put the occasional one of the other notes in the scale you can put on the strong beat. But if you do it too much, you sort of lose the sound of the Mixolydian. You lose the sound of that particular mode. So in that case, it's an interesting thing where the rules don't apply consistently across all scales and across all modes. You've got to be careful about how you're using them.
Fantastic. Right. We've got one last question, which is on fretboard visualization. So any preference on visualization systems, cage, 3-note per string, to work on the scales? Okay,
so I'm going to end this with a little bit of controversy then, because I have a passionate hatred for 3-note per string scales. I think it's an absolute waste of time learning the fretboard like that, and I will stick by that as strongly as I can. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them being that whenever you play any chord shape, the chord shape is vertical. So when I play, for example, A minor is a vertical chord, and you see it vertically. When I play the E7, that chord is also vertical. So using a vertical system like caged, where you're using vertical shapes, allows you to superimpose the chords in your mind over what's going on much, much easier. So that's one problem. The other problem is, if you think about this as a bit of a permutations game, there are 5 different cage boxes for each scale. So if you're learning the melodic minor, let's say just take the two scales, melodic minor and caged, and cage for the major scale, that would require you to learn 10 boxes. Now, there are 7 3-note per string boxes, so that requires you for 2 scales to learn 14 different scale boxes. So the more scales we learn, the more we add to this, the more extra boxes you're learning in the 3-note per string system, the more superimpositions you have to make. If you imagine, for example, I'm now superimposing 2 scales over the top of each other, there's going to be 5 different ways of doing that as well. And then, so if I've got the 3-note per string system with 7 different boxes, I'm going to have 7 different boxes for major scale, 7 different boxes for the altered scale, and then 7 different ways of superimposing those things, which brings us to 21 different problems to solve as opposed to 15. So the more things you learn, the more 3-note per string is extra information that gets in your way and causes a problem. So that's my opinion on it. Again, that's not shared by a lot of people. I'm aware Luke might have a lot of different answers to that, but that's what I think about the 3-note per string system.
I just do the 8-note per string system, and then you just use one string, you got all the notes there, and you don't have to do anything else.
Yeah, that also works.
I strongly agree. I haven't met anyone who expressed it so passionately, so I think it was nice knowing you. I think you're going to be cancelled by the 3-note per string.
Yeah. It's already happened. Don't worry. I've already run into that problem with a lot of modern metal players learn the guitar via 3-note per string systems, and those players have a notoriously hard time getting into blues and jazz and basically other guitar styles because the 3-note per string system seems to only help them with very technical modern metal and not with actually like approaching the guitar from all sides as like a concept that you can use in a wide range of styles. So generally speaking, that's something I've seen in my experience, and it causes a lot of problems in my own tuition anyway, when people suddenly realize that they have to superimpose all these 7 boxes and there's a nightmare amount of stuff to learn.
Yeah, well, or even just understanding what note is what in a region in the K system. Like, you've got one region covered by one shape, you know what all those notes are. That shape,
exactly.
That one note exists in 3 different 3-note per string systems. You got to work out what it's like when you start it on your first finger. You say, right. Last question is coming from me. There's loads of vocabulary in the book. There's loads of licks and things like that. And you also talked about, you mentioned it briefly in this, but I also know you're a transcriber, and you transcribe a lot for your own learning. How do you recommend people? What would you recommend people do with the vocabulary in the book to get the most out of it?
Sure. I think with any, and maybe this goes along with any instructional book, there's always a bit of a dichotomy between theory and your ear, and using your ear in a way that actually helps you to play. The way I think about this is that the ear is always faster. It's always the more direct way of playing. It's always going to be, it's the language circuits in your brain that you're using when you use your ear to play, and they're always 10 times faster than calculating where you are and what you're doing. So one of the things I would highly recommend is if there's certain ideas in the book that you really like the sound of, if you go through the videos of some of the licks and you think, oh, that's a really cool like little concept. That's I like the idea of shifting here, or I like the idea of this chromaticism or this particular concept. Spend a lot of time with that and like really try and explore that concept as much as you possibly can. Try and sing all of the ideas through if you can, even if you're doing it super slow. If you're just like singing the pitches and singing where the resolutions go, using those language circuits in your brain to really like get the most out of that little concept, and then moving on from there, that's going to give you a much, much deeper understanding than the person who tries to go through the book as fast as possible and work through it and just learn all the licks. That's going to take some time to do, but also, you're much better off taking a segment that you really like the sound of, or another example of this is like, for example, maybe you really want to learn how to play major blues stuff, outside major blues stuff. So maybe you go into that chapter first and you really learn all those ideas. But trying to tap into doing these things slowly, understanding where the lines are resolving, slowing them all down, trying to sing as many of the pitches as you can, even if that's really hard to do to start with, which I'm sure for a lot of people that is going to be very, very difficult to start with doing, but you might have to slow that down all the way to like 40 BPM if you're starting off with that. But that's something, again, that from my experience, loads of really great transcribers swear by. They all swear by being able to pitch things accurately in your head and pitch an idea and transcribe a solo and being able to sing the same solo that you've just transcribed. Those things are something that I think a lot of fantastic musicians are sort of that's their Bible for this kind of stuff. So make sure that's something you're doing. And yeah, the other thing as well I would say is start with what's interesting to you. Like if you listen through everything and you find the last chapter's great, you don't necessarily have to start with the first chapter. You can just dive straight into that one. It might be difficult, but you're probably going to have more energy because you're passionate about what you're learning there than trying to slog through all the other ideas to get there in the first place. You don't have to treat it as a section A, section B, section C, section D sort of deal. You can just jump in whenever you want and really deal with the things that you think are sounding the best and the things that you really want to take away from it.
Wicked. We've got one last question here, which is it fair to say that if you're playing a major blues in a chromatic context, I could use all the Charlie Christian shapes I know and love?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of those are going to work. And yeah, that's the other thing as well with all these things is if there's a player like that, that you're really happy with and you really like the sound of, just use those shapes. Just play like that for a little bit and then try and incorporate other stuff. That's what a lot of people do when they transcribe things. They just they're going in a mix of things. So yeah, take the people that you're inspired by and do that.
Awesome. And how important is writing licks, or do you recommend that? I'm guessing there's lots of theory in the book, and you kind of go, hey, you might not like the example, but if you take the theory and harvest it for your own stuff, you might find something.
Yeah, it's something that I find immensely useful and do constantly is just um, trying to take the abstracted piece of theory more generally and just say, well, why does all these things work and what is it about the lick that sounds good? Again, sometimes, for example, one of the things you might notice is you play through something and it sounds really good and you really like the sound of something, and then you realize it's nothing to do with the outside playing; it's something to do with the rhythm of the lick. Like, for example, it might just start in a weird place in the bar, and it's not something that you've necessarily done very often is start on the offbeat in that way, or it might use some sequence of notes or some ascending pattern that you're just like, I can apply that somewhere else. So again, have a really general interpretation of these things and just take the things that you feel are like actually um, things that you find challenging and also that really appeal.
Wicked. Someone's asked, oh, we got to talk a bit about that guitar. And got any favorite fusion songs that demonstrate some of your favorite chromaticism?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm a huge fan of a lot of Wayne Kranz's stuff. I really like the whole of Two Drink Minimum. I think is a fantastic album, purely again because of the fact that it goes through not just some of this vocabulary in some of his solos, but killer sense of time to a point where I don't think anyone's even managed to get close to his sense of like rhythm and groove over the years. And there's so much stuff in that album that if you try and transcribe it and you try and transcribe what he's playing, it challenges people a lot in terms of their rhythmic sophistication, almost more than it does in terms of melodic and in improvisational sophistication. So that's a really fantastic album for that. And it's combining all of those things because I'm really a big advocate of good rhythm while you're doing these kind of chromatic ideas, and that's an album that does that very well. Guthrie Govan's solo album, his first solo album, is the sort of classic on this stuff. It's one of those things where there's a lot of that stuff used. Um, I'm a big fan of a lot of Holdsworth in particular, Wardenclyffe Tower being the album. I think if you want to, that's a bit. Wardenclyffe Tower and 16 Men of Tain, I think, is Holdsworth's albums I'm a big fan of. And again, there's a lot of chromatic vocabulary and outside playing in both of those, dealing with very advanced chord changes as well. So those are really challenging things to try and transcribe. I always try and pick things that are very sort of tricky to transcribe because I feel like that does the biggest thing for your brain. And then also Michael Brecker's Don't Try This at Home would be the last one. I think that's a fantastic album and is one of these things which you may only make it 5 seconds through a transcription before you realize it's all impossible because it's saxophone, but it's still worth your time.
Wicked. So one last shout out for the book. We'll tell you a little bit about it. I'll post the link again in the chat. You can go to guitarvivo.com. Congratulations on your new book. Stepping Outside is now available in PDF and on Amazon internationally. It is 160 pages, has 5 backing tracks. It's got a very progressive method to it that takes you from kind of beginning with these chromatic ideas to the nth degree, basically as far as you want to take it. Anything else? Oh, someone's asked, can you apply this to jazz, blues, swing music?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. A lot of these chromaticisms, even though they might be demonstrated in a hard rock context, some of the actual chromatic cells are exactly the same as what like a lot of jazz players would use. They're just jazz players would swing them as opposed to playing them slightly straighter in a more funk context. So yeah, a lot of the things in there can be applied if you are into that style of music.
Wicked. So firstly, I actually have to say thank you to all of you guys for tuning in. You have been a really good group. I do a lot of these. You've been my favorite. The questions have been fantastic, and it's made my life really easy to just have so many things to throw at Ben. So thank you all so much for being so engaged and for really listening and asking insightful questions. Ben, thank you. That was incredible. It's always tough for me to not have a guitar in my hand during these. It was especially tough today with all that stuff going on that made me just want to pick it up and try it out myself. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all that great insight.
Yeah, and I also like to say like a huge shout out to Luke and the team at Guitar Vivo. They're continually getting some really good work done with people who are writing really interesting books. I think they've not published anything that's not fantastic yet. I've read through a lot of them. As you mentioned before, you mentioned that Don Mock's book is fantastic as well, and I'm really glad to sort of be on the same list of people, although it feels a bit ridiculous because some of the players you're getting in are absolute monsters, and it's kind of people I would also attend the masterclass with. So yeah, it's been fantastic working with the team, and thank you very much.
Thank you, man. I don't have to say this. We are invite only, and I approached you because I love what you do. I thought you were a great teacher, and as you all can agree from this session, I think you've kind of proved me right. That was fantastic. Guys, the replay for this, I am going to send out a link tomorrow as well, but if you've joined in late, you want to catch up, go back to the link that brought you here in the email, and there's a way to watch it on YouTube. On YouTube, you can rewind it. It started a few minutes late, but yeah, you can rewatch it now, all on YouTube. And if you guys have any questions, you can email me, luke@guitarvivo.com. Ben, where can we find out more about you?
So I've got an Instagram page, which is my name, Ben Kerrigan Music, where I post a lot of things on my own projects, and there's also a Trio page that you can find if you Google my name as well. I've got a YouTube channel which is under the same name. So if you YouTube my name or you Instagram my name, you should be able to find all those social media pages, and I post bits about my own music and my own education. So that's all on those platforms mainly, and that's normally where you'll find me.
Amazing. Can you play us out? Can you demo? I think you know what track I'm going to ask for. We did, so with some of these tracks we wanted them to be based on actual music. So what we do is we might take a groove from one song, or we might take a chord progression that we want you to look at and tweak it. Can you tell us about the inspiration for this song? I think we changed the chords for this, but it's got a groove and
yeah. So it was looking at Lingus from Snarky Puppy, and I sort of regretted doing this because Simon sent me back an absolutely amazing version of this, and also it ended up being incredibly difficult to play anything that I liked over the backing track because and trying to keep up with his playing. So I will do my best.
If anyone doesn't know this track, it's Lingus by Snarky Puppy. There's an incredible version with their band doing it live. There's also a version with Chris Potter, which is so phenomenal. So if you wanted to see someone phrasing incredibly and doing all this chromatic stuff, check out Chris Potter playing Lingus with Snarky Puppy, and check out Ben playing it right now.
I'm put on the spot now. Something like that.
Something like that. Man,
Yeah.
thank you so much. That was epic. I think everyone agrees. Callum says, geez. I think I echo that sentiment. Guys,
That's
thank
a
you all
roast.
so much.
That's one of those things. I haven't touched that since I got it. So it's one of those things where I definitely need to go back on that one and work it
Well,
out again.
do I have a book
yeah.
for you? I've got a book. It's got the
Yeah,
chords written out.
I'll
It's got licks.
yeah.
One last thing, guys. Look out for my emails. Our next event is in a couple of weeks with Brett Garsed, and it's slide guitar in standard tuning.
Like I said about scary players on Luke's list, Brett
Yeah.
is. If you don't know who Brett Garsed is, you need to know who Brett Garsed is.
So not only is it slide guitar in standard tuning, but he's innovative. He's doing things like the way he's angling it. He's doing combinations of. He's making some sounds with the slide that I think everyone should know. And he's a rock player, so it's not like kind of blues vocabulary. It's like if you like rock music and maybe Jeff Beck and even modern rock stuff. Yeah, check out that coming up in a couple of weeks. And check out Ben's book. It's going to be awesome. Ben, thank you so much again. And I will see you all
No
next.
worries. Thank you.
Oh, wait. We didn't mention the guitar. What guitar is that?
This is a Munson Avenger, Munson. So it's a UK-based company that do their own custom builds. If you're interested.
Munson. Yeah, if you missed that, email me. I'll set you up a link. Ben follows.